Hey guys, okay. I am finally getting to this video. I have been postponing watching this for weeks because I've been too lazy to dedicate the hour plus that it will probably take me to watch through it and react to it, right? Alexander the Great, all parts by Epic History TV. Alright, so we're probably gonna start. The video is probably going to start with Philip II and his conquests, okay? And probably a little bit on his reforms of the Macedonian military. And then we'll get into the life of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is probably one of the most fascinating characters in all of history because, you know, like, let's take a look. Let's look at our modern day, right? To us in our modern day, it seems crazy to think of someone so young to start off in their teens, ruling a country, then completely decimating the world's strongest military and the world's biggest empire at the time period. All before he was like, what, 20? He started his conquests and his push into the Persian Empire, right? You think of someone that young doing it today, and you're like, no, that's impossible, right? Right? That'd be like, I guess that would be, the only equivalent I can think of it would be probably like, I don't know, in terms of proportions with population and stuff, maybe, I don't know, Canada or Mexico deciding, having an 18-year-old president or whatever, then declare war on the USA and win, right? That's kind of the equivalent we see with Alexander the Great. So anyways, enough talking. Let's go ahead and start watching.
In 334 BC, Alexander, king of Macedonia, began one of the greatest military campaigns in history.
Starting with Alexander right off the bat.
Against the superpower of the age, the Persian Empire. Just 20 years old.
The narrator is so good.
His brilliant and fearless leadership won him battle after battle. And in an astonishing 10-year campaign that took him to the edge of the known world.
And look, he also did all this in in like 10 years, right? That's just crazy. Like, the Romans took decades and decades to conquer that same, like, rough amount of territory. So, like, yeah, and we in the modern day, the Romans are, you know, attributed to being one of the greatest powers in history, and rightfully so, because of how long they ruled the territory that they controlled, right? And how influential they are to, I guess, Western society as a whole. Maybe, obviously, to Eastern society and history, they aren't really that important. They're like probably a footnote in terms of like trade relations. But what the Romans would set up in Europe for later centuries, you know, they really makes them super important, right? But, you know, for someone at 20 years old to start a campaign that would take only a decade to conquer all that territory that the Romans would then conquer later on in history, and it would take them far longer than it took him, is incredible.
He carved out one of the largest empires ever known. Few men have had such a massive impact on the course of history.
I like the use of total war.
To the Persians, he was Alexander the Accursed. But to the West, he was immortalized as Alexander the Great.
Ooh, we're getting Invicta in here too.
Ancient Greece. From around 500 BC, this rugged land was the scene of remarkable developments in art, philosophy, and warfare. Its two greatest city-states were Athens, a naval power where democracy, art, drama and philosophy flourished. And Sparta, an austere, militaristic society, famed for its formidable army. In 480 BC, these two city-states had joined forces to fight an invasion by the mighty Persian Empire. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small...
Can I just say, I've said this before in other videos in which that have covered the Battle of Thermopylae. Or Thermopylae, however you want to pronounce it. I think the proper pronunciation is Thermopylae. I could be wrong though, please correct me if I am. I always forget how far south into Greece this battle was. You know, I've always pictured the battle to be up here, not down here, right? So, yeah.
Greek force, led by 300
something weird about me.
Spartans, held up the enormous Persian army for 3 days, before they were finally encircled and killed. Then, in the Straits...
Obviously, he's very brushing over the background history. I'm sure the writers of this episode, or well, of this video, know that the battle wasn't solely, you know, the Spartans holding off the invaders, right? Because they did make a mention of the Spartans and Athenians teaming up to fight the Persian invaders. So they most likely know that there were several thousand other combatants there. It's just obviously a brief rundown, I guess to say, of the battle, so that they can, you know, they obviously have to get the context set up so that they can then talk about Alexander the Great,
of Salamis,
which is fine.
The Greek fleet defeated the Persian navy. But they couldn't prevent the Persians burning...
Alright, internet died, and now it's back.
Prevent the Persians burning the sacred temples of the Athenian Acropolis. The next year at Plataea, the Greeks won a decisive land battle against the Persians. And forced
But I
them
like
to
they're
abandon
covering
their
the
invasion.
lesser-known battles of the Persian invasion, right? I really like this. This is really good.
The next 50 years were the golden age of classical Greece. But rising tension between Athens and Sparta and their allies eventually led to war, dragging the
Peloponnesian
Greek
War.
world into decades of destructive fighting. Wars between the Greek city-states continued for almost a century, leaving them exhausted and vulnerable to a new rising power to the north. For centuries, sophisticated Greeks had viewed the mountainous kingdom of Macedonia as a backwater, Hicksville, barely Greek at all.
What's crazy about this though, like, just looking at it from our modern perspective, probably something that gets tiring of hearing me say all the time, from our modern perspective, but the southern Greeks not viewing Macedonia as Greek, but, you know, obviously today what we view as Greece is like all of this, right? And honestly, because of Alexander the Great, Macedonia is seen as, or well, this region, because obviously there's a country today called Macedonia, I think. Macedonia, right? Macedon. I think they, up here. And there's contention between that and the Greeks, right? Of our modern day. But because of Alexander the Great, you know, we view this as pretty Greek, you know. But I think obviously even in our modern day, like when you think of Greece, you think of Athens. You think of Athens and you think of Alexander the Great, I would say. If you're asked about Greece, you're asked like, what are two things you know about Greece? You're probably like, oh, Alexander the Great or Athens or Sparta. You know, those are the top three.
But under King Philip II, Macedonia
I was right,
emerged
Philip.
as a
They're going to talk
formidable
about him.
military force. His most famous reform?
And
The
his
introduction
reforms
of the
called it.
salisa, an 18-foot pike, twice the length of a normal Greek spear, and wielded by trained infantry fighting in close formation, known as a phalanx.
God, it's also weird. You know, you look back on it and you're like, this was a revolutionary military tactic at the time, military reform at the time. But today it seems so primitive, right? It's just interesting how stuff has evolved over time.
In 338
God, we're only
BC,
3
at the
minutes
Battle
in.
of Chaeronea, Philip's army crushed the joint forces of Thebes and Athens. Through alliance and conquest, Philip had already gained control over most of his neighbours. Now, following this victory, he united all Greece in an alliance known as the Hellenic League, or League of Corinth, with Philip as hegemon, or supreme commander. Only Sparta stood aside. Philip began to plan a
Spartans.
great campaign, a pan-Hellenic or all-Greek war against the Persian Empire. Their old foe was now an ailing superpower, its great riches ripe for the taking. But on the eve of launching his war, Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard, victim of Macedonia's brutal court rivalries.
Does anyone know more about his murder? Isn't it rumored that Alexander might have had something to do with it? I don't know if that's if that's a valid rumor or not. But you know, I don't know much about Philip II aside from that reformations that he brought into his military, in which he incorporated the phalanx, right, and his near unification of all of what we consider Greek of Greece. I don't know much else about him aside from that. So, any information is welcome.
He was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Brilliant.
Yeah, hold up. Going back to my rumor on Alexander, didn't Philip have a second son, or Philip's wife or whatever was pregnant with another child, and Alexander was threatened by the birth of this child, so he was like, all right, murder my dad and then gain power so then my brother cannot usurp anything from me or whatever, right? I think that was how it went.
Restless, tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, and already an experienced military commander. Alexander inherited his father's grand plan to invade Persia, but first he had to secure his own position as king. At home, he had potential rivals executed, then crushed rebellions in Illyria, Thessaly, and central Greece. He made a special example of Thebes, completely destroyed.
He was a brutal guy when it came to it. But I think, as we will see later on, we will also see that he was willing to cooperate with locals, right? He would adopt the Persian model of rule, in which when the Persians conquered people, as long as those people did not really resist or rebel, the locals would be able to keep the, governmental rule that they were used to. But obviously there were certain circumstances in which the Persians would push their form of rule upon the locals, right? It's not, there's always exceptions to rules in history. But for the most part, Persian Empire, especially also if we look back at Achaemenid, or well, this is the Achaemenid Empire, because that's the family, right? But when Cyrus established the empire or something, I think it was Cyrus that I researched a while back. When he conquered a new people, if the locals weren't going to be resistant to him, they would typically be allowed to keep their local rule, their local leaders, and their religion, and that was a very, you know, if we look back at it today, we see that it was a pretty, I guess, in a sense, progressive empire for the time period.
Destroying the ancient city and selling its people into slavery.
Except the slave part,
In
right?
the
That's not
spring of
progressive.
334 BC, now ready to launch his war against the Persian Empire, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was the start of one of the greatest military campaigns in history.
Okay, we're gonna go into the army. Okay. I'm curious about this.
Alexander's army was about 40,000 strong, drawn from all parts of Greece. The infantry were commanded by the veteran Macedonian general Parmenion. In the front rank, 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, armed with the 18-foot sarissa. These were professional soldiers, well-trained and drilled, who formed up for battle in the phalanx, 16 ranks deep. This packed formation
I just want to comment on the quality of this cinematic here they're using from Total War, right? This is cool.
presented a solid
this is pretty
wall
cool.
of iron spear tips and was virtually unstoppable. But it was also difficult to maneuver and highly vulnerable to attacks on its flanks
Yes.
or rear. So 3,000 elite infantry, the hypaspists, or shield bearers, armed with shorter spears, guarded its flanks. They were commanded by Parmenion's son, Nicanor. The second line of Alexander's army was made up of 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 mercenaries, armed as hoplites. They took their name from the hoplon, their large round shield, and carried shorter 8-foot spears. A hoplite phalanx was not as effective as the Macedonian phalangites, but still well armed and heavily armored for the time. The Agrianes were the army's elite skirmishers, expert javelin throwers from what's now southern Bulgaria. Other skirmishers from Thrace and Illyria were armed with javelins, slings, and bows. The shock troops of Alexander's army were the companion cavalry.
Definitely, the companion cavalry have probably become so prominent. They've probably been a bit mythicized in our history, right? Because they are probably seen as Alexander's thing, right? One of the things that he's definitely known for when it comes to the military are his companion cavalry. At least in my point of view, from just my experience in history, right, and what is talked about when it comes to Alexander the Great.
1,800 elite horsemen, armed with spear and sword, commanded by Philotas, another son of Parmenion. Alexander led the royal squadron in person. There were also 1,800 cavalry from Thessaly, commanded by Callas, 600 from other parts of Greece, led by Erigyius.
What's really cool about this is it really shows the diversity of Alexander's army, right? You know, when you think of Alexander the Great, you probably just, obviously in our modern viewpoint, it's like, oh, they're just all Greeks, so that's not really diverse, right? But for the time period back then, in which the way their cultures were, in which the way they lived, these essentially were completely different people. It'd be like I guess a close example would be kind of the Allied armies in World War II, right? There's a general combined culture with the English-speaking ones, right? With the British largely British-descended countries. The USA, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all working together. Obviously, South Africa's in that too, but South Africa is, and they are a mixed colony. They are not a white settler colony, and they mainly fought in Africa, right? I think. I could be wrong. You can correct me there too. But what I'm trying to say is, like, there was an overriding culture, but still, when you look back at it, you see these different countries fighting together against the same enemy. This is kind of what it was like, right? I guess the different, like, the Thessalian cavalry and then Alexander's companion cavalry, that'd be like the USA and Canada, right? Fighting together, you know? That's at least how I think of it. Probably explaining myself poorly.
And Paeonia under Cassander.
Cassander I've heard about before. I've heard of Parmenion. But the other generals I'm a little about. Or haven't really heard anything about them.
The great Persian Empire was divided into provinces, called satrapies. Each satrapy was ruled by a governor, or satrap. Those in Asia Minor, now threatened by Alexander's invasion, met to discuss strategy. Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, urged them to avoid battle with Alexander. Instead, he advised them to use a scorched earth strategy, to burn villages and crops and withdraw to the interior. Alexander's army, he promised, would quickly starve. It was good advice, but the satraps were unwilling to lay waste to their own provinces.
I remember this story. I've heard this before, yeah.
So they decided.
Essentially, that strategy of scorched earth is what kind of the Russians would use in World War II against the Germans. And actually, the Russians are quite famous for their scorched earth tactic because they have done it numerous times to invading countries. They've done it to the Swedes, they've done it to Napoleon, and they've done it to Germany. But here we have an example of what happens when, obviously, the locals don't want to burn their homes. They don't want to burn their fields. They don't want to burn or risk not getting food, right?
Decided to face Alexander's army at the river Granicus. The Persian army formed up behind the river, which was shallow but 60 feet wide with steep banks. Their front line was a wall of cavalry, about
God, this is such a well-made video.
From across the empire. Medes and Hyrcanians from modern Iran, Bactrians from Afghanistan, and Paphlagonians from Turkey's Black Sea coast.
God, another army showcasing
Behind,
just
in reserve,
so much diversity.
The infantry, several
for the time
thousand
period.
Greek mercenaries, a common sight in Persian armies at this time. These men fought for Persian gold and were armed with the round shield and short spear of hoplites. The Persians may have been unsure if they could trust these men in combat against fellow Greeks, and so placed them at the rear.
I mean, that's a fair assumption, right? To fight your own people, right? I'm sure if the Persians, I'm sure if the Greeks had Persian mercenaries, they wouldn't necessarily trust them either if the roles were reversed. So it's a fair thing not to trust mercenaries, especially because they're kind of in it for gold.
Alexander, determined to attack and destroy this Persian force before it could retreat, raced to the Granicus with his best troops. On his left wing, he posted Thessalian, Greek, and Thracian cavalry under Parmenion's command. In the center were the massed spears of the phalanx, its 6 divisions commanded by Perdiccas, Koinos, Amintas, Philip, Meleager, and Crateros.
That's a lot of people. There's a lot of commanders.
On the right, Alexander himself with the companion cavalry under Philotas, as well as the elite Hypaspists, the Agrianes javelin throwers, and the archers. Alexander, with 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in all, was probably slightly outnumbered. But ignoring advice to wait until dawn to cross the river, he ordered an immediate assault. He sent a squadron of companion cavalry to ford the river, followed by a regiment of hypaspists and the Paeonian light cavalry. Alexander, calling on his men to show their courage, then led his right wing across the river.
By the way, I'm just going to say this right now. I'm going to preface it as the battles. For the battles part, I'm probably not going to be talking too much for the battles because I'm not a military historian, as you guys know. So, I know some bits about ancient military combat and tactics. But like, even if we were to talk about late 800s England, my field of study, if we were to talk about military tactics, I'm not gonna really know that too well. So, anyways, go back into it.
As they reached the middle of the river, the Greeks came under a hail of javelins, darts, and arrows from the Persian line. Those that made it to the far bank were immediately charged by the Persian cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting. He attacked where the whole mass of their cavalry and leaders were stationed. Around him, a desperate conflict raged. Horses were jammed against horses, and men against men. The Macedonians striving to drive the Persians away from the riverbank. The Persians determined to prevent them crossing, and to push them back into the river. Alexander's attack seemed reckless, but he was buying time for the rest of his army to cross the river.
Okay.
Including the irresistible Macedonian phalanx.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then, suddenly, Alexander was fighting for his life, charged by 2 Persian nobles.
Okay, yeah, this is something I've heard about before as well. Alexander risked his life a lot, and he had a ton of close calls throughout his military campaigns. And it's just crazy that, he didn't die sooner.
Rhoesaces rode up to Alexander and struck him on the head with his sword, breaking off a piece of his helmet. But the helmet broke the force of the blow, and Alexander struck him down with his lance. Then, from behind, Mithridates raised his sword against the king, but Black Clitus, son of Dropidas, anticipated his blow, struck his arm, and cut it off, sword and all.
Dang.
Now the Greek army was across the river, and the Persian cavalry faced a wall of Macedonian spears. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's attack meant Persia's Greek mercenaries hadn't even had time to join the battle. Alexander, in a blood rage, or possibly regarding these Greeks as traitors, ignored their appeals for mercy.
Oh shit.
The mercenaries were surrounded on all sides and massacred.
Dude, that's brutal. Oh, I didn't know that.
Alexander had won a great victory. Asia Minor now lay at his mercy. But the Persian Empire was still a land of immense wealth and power. Already, it was mobilizing its vast resources to face him. If Alexander was to conquer this empire and take his place in history, he'd next have to face Darius, King of Kings himself. Now, as Alexander approached Sardis, capital of the Persian province of Lydia, its commander surrendered without a fight.
Alright, that's
Before
simple.
Alexander could advance further, he needed to neutralize Persian naval power. Persia
How did
had
he
a
do that?
powerful fleet with major naval bases around the eastern Mediterranean that could potentially cut his lines of communication back to Greece. Rather than challenge the Persians at sea, Alexander decided to attack its nearest bases, the Greek coastal cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus. Both put up determined resistance, but were taken by winter. The following spring of 333 BC, Alexander continued his advance into Lycia and Phrygia. At Gordium, he was shown the legendary Gordian Knot. A prophecy said that whoever could unpick it would rule all Asia. Alexander simply took his sword and sliced it in half.
I've seen that story, yeah. I've heard that one before.
Meanwhile, Memnon
What a
of Rhodes,
Chad.
a skilled Greek general in Persian service, led Persian warships into the Aegean and captured the islands of Chios and Lesbos. But after Memnon's sudden death from illness, the offensive was abandoned.
But the animation and drawings in this video are so good.
Since
Such top
Alexander's
quality.
army crossed the Hellespont and invaded the Persian Empire. Now Alexander led his men into Cilicia and was soon poised to cross the Nur Mountains into Syria. But then the main Persian army, led by King Darius III himself,
Oh, here we go. This battle is
emerged
very
behind
important.
the Greek army to the north. Darius was determined to trap and destroy Alexander's army, which he outnumbered almost 2 to 1. So he blocked Alexander's only escape route by moving his army to the coastal plain near.
Right, that is very intelligent of Darius, right? Or Darius, however you want to pronounce him. Even though one of those is probably the right one, I'm not sure which one is. Cutting him off, you have the numbers, so, but he's not attacking him. He's gonna force Alexander to push him, right? I can't remember what Alexander did in response. There's a part of me that thinks Alexander just continued to move south and just ignored Darius. Can't remember.
Issus, just 6 miles wide, from mountains to sea. The narrow battlefield would force Alexander to fight, but it also prevented Darius.
So Alexander did have to fight, okay. He did go and fight.
Exploiting his huge numerical advantage. His army, by some estimates, was up to 100,000 strong, and contained some of the finest soldiers in his vast empire.
Okay, so, but it also, alright, now I'm understanding it, okay. So because of Darius's large army, but because of the terrain he chose to fight it, he couldn't get, he couldn't flank around Alexander's army.
Including 10,000 of his own household troops, known as the Immortals.
If you've watched the 300 movie, you know what those are.
His best cavalry were massed on his right towards the sea, where the ground was better for horses. His best infantry, his Greek mercenary hoplites, formed the center.
So I think I know how this battle goes. I mean, obviously Alexander wins it, but I think I know how Alexander won it. I think I've watched
Alexander
a documentary on this before.
Battle, once again entrusting his left wing, nearest the sea, to Parmenion, with the Greek cavalry and infantry. In the center, as always, was the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander positioned himself and his best troops on the right wing toward the mountain slopes. His elite Agriane javelin throwers, his archers, and behind them the Hypaspists and the companion cavalry. When Alexander saw the strength of the Persian cavalry facing Parmenion on the left, he moved across his Thessalian cavalry to reinforce him. Despite his overwhelming numbers, Darius held his position behind a small river, the Pinarus, and waited for Alexander to attack. He didn't have to wait long. Alexander called out to his men, urging them to fight bravely, picking out some by name. Then, at the head of his army's right wing, he charged.
What I like about this documentary, right off the bat from that little note there of Darius would call out some by name, they're showcasing his quality as well as a leader. They're not like demeaning him or like painting him in a negative light. They're painting him in a fairly positive light. You know, because he isn't really the bad guy here. No one's the bad guy. Well, I guess to some people you can say Darius is the bad guy, and then other people say Alexander's the bad guy based on the history that they've heard, right? You know. But the truth of the matter is, everyone's gray in morality a bit, especially back then. Well, I guess in our modern day, some of the things that would, you know, from our modern perspective, right, there are more things that maybe paint them in a negative light because we wouldn't think to do some of those things anymore. But, yeah. Really shows that he cared about his men in a sense, that he's willing to call out, like he knew some of his men personally.
Once again,
in a way.
The speed and shock of the Macedonian advance sent the enemy reeling back. But in the center of the battlefield, the Macedonian phalanx was in trouble. In its effort to keep up with Alexander, its formation had become disordered. Now, in fierce fighting with Darius's Greek mercenaries, the phalanx was slowly being driven back. Alexander, seeing the danger, regrouped and led the companions in a headlong charge straight at the Persian center. The Greek mercenaries threatened on their flank were soon in disarray, and the Macedonian
this
phalanx
is the battle I was thinking of,
resume
right?
its advance.
Yeah, I've heard of this battle before. There was a documentary at one point. I can't remember if it was a History Channel or not, but it was years ago, like over a decade, honestly, that I last watched it. And so it's a very vague memory, but I remember this battle. Like, Alexander comes in, he's losing it at first, and then swings his companion cavalry around and starts attacking them through the flanks, and boom, he wins the battle.
Alexander fought his way towards the great king Darius himself.
Oh shit. Damn.
Rather than face this apparently mad and fearless Macedonian king, Darius fled the battlefield in his royal chariot. Meanwhile, the Macedonian left wing under Parmenion was in a desperate fight against the best of the Persian cavalry. If the Persians could break through here, they could envelop Alexander's army and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But Parmenion and his troops fought doggedly and continued to hold the Persians at bay. As the news that Darius had fled spread among his troops, they abandoned the fight and tried to save themselves.
Fair reasoning for Darius's troops.
The battle turned into a massacre. Ptolemy, one of the Macedonian commanders, told Alexander there were so many Persian dead, his men had used them to fill a deep ravine, so they could cross over it.
Oof. Don't know how true that is, though. Son of Amun. Ammon? Amun.
The Battle of Issus was a stunning victory for Alexander. And amongst the spoils of victory were Darius's wife, mother, and 3 children, all taken alive and well treated by Alexander.
Nice that he that
With
they
the
added
Persian
that
field
distinction
army in
in. They were
retreat,
treated well.
Alexander now turned to subduing the western territories of the Persian Empire. The next year, 332, the coastal cities of Phoenicia submitted to Alexander, ending Persian naval power in the Mediterranean. But the island city of Tyre resisted. Tyre's defenders fought bravely and skillfully, even when Alexander began building a causeway to the island, protected by 2 giant siege towers, which they counterattacked with fire ships.
Dang.
But after 7 months, the city walls were breached and Tyre fell. Most of its citizens were killed or enslaved.
Oh, dang.
Gaza, too, was taken by siege. Alexander continued to Pelusium on the Nile Delta, where the Persian governor of Egypt surrendered the entire province to Alexander, along with the royal treasury.
Dang.
At Memphis, priests of this ancient land welcomed Alexander as their liberator from Persian rule.
Time to found the
and
city of
crowned him
Alexandria.
pharaoh.
One of the many.
At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city, Alexandria. Then travelled to the desert oracle of Siwa, where according to some accounts the priests welcomed him as son of Amun, king of the gods. Alexander returned east to Tyre, where in 331 BC he received news of trouble back home. Despite his great victories over the Persians, many Greeks regarded Alexander as a tyrant.
Yeah, so the little research I have done on Alexander, he pretty much kind of ignored the Greek homelands once he went on his conquest. He didn't really care to rule them. Now it is argued that perhaps once he finished conquering the Persian Empire, and when he was on his return trip home towards the end of his life, before he died, it's argued that he was now going to focus on the ruling of his empire. I'm not the one to say whether or not how true it is, but during his conquests, he was pretty negligent of ruling his people back home, and he kind of left that to like advisors and locals, which is not necessarily the best thing.
King Agis of Sparta, with Persian support, now launched a revolt against Macedonia. Antipater, Alexander's commander in Greece, was already dealing with rebellion in Thrace. But he quickly marched south and met Agis in battle near the city of Megalopolis.
I've heard of Antipater before. Very briefly though, not too much.
Even the legendary Spartans were now no match for Macedonian military power. The Spartan army was crushed. King Agis himself was among the fallen.
Well, that's one way to handle the rebellion, just kill the leader.
With his base in Greece secure once more, Alexander advanced towards the Persian heartlands, seeking a final showdown with Darius. He received a letter from the Persian king offering him a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half his empire in exchange for peace. But Alexander's stunning victories...
I feel like most people in their right minds probably would accept that that treaty, that proposal. Not Alexander. No, he wanted it all.
All the oracles and acclamations had now convinced him that his destiny was to rule the world.
He was probably a bit
Rejected
egotistical.
the Persian king's offer. He didn't want half the empire.
Wanted
he
it
was
all.
coming to take it all.
Yeah. What a Chad move. What a Chad. Absolute Chad.
In 334 BC, Alexander, 21-year-old ruler of the small Greek kingdom of Macedonia, led an invasion of the vast Persian Empire. It seemed impossible odds. But thanks
Just
to
to
Greek
recap,
military dominance
looks
and
like this was a
Alexander's fearless
part 2
leadership,
or something.
he won 2 great battles against the Persians, at the river Granicus and at Issus. Having subdued Persian lands west of the Euphrates River, he now headed east into the empire's heartlands, seeking a final showdown with the Persian king, Darius III. Receiving news that a great Persian army led by Darius had assembled at Gaugamela, near modern Mosul in Iraq, he made straight for it.
I really like this, I guess, mapping of what the modern day countries are, and, you know, where, like, Alexander is now and where Darius is. You know, that's really cool. Helps really gives you a sense of where everything's going on. I like it.
This was Darius's last chance to stop Alexander, and Alexander's chance to smash Persian power once and for all.
Gaugamela. Oh yeah, I've heard of this battle. I think this is the battle where Darius dies. Darius dies in battle,
had
right?
chosen to fight on open ground, where his advantage in numbers would be more telling. His soldiers had also worked hard to clear and flatten the terrain, to make it suitable for Persian war chariots. By modern estimates, the Persian army was between 50 and 80,000 strong, and made up of contingents from across the empire. Infantry from Syria and Babylonia, cavalry from Armenia, India, and
Another
Central Asia.
showcasing of just how widespread the
The
Persian
200
Empire
sized
was and just how
chariots.
diverse the armies were. Really cool. Really,
Even
really
a
cool. I
handful
like
of
it.
war elephants. Alexander's army was smaller, and may have been outnumbered by as much as 2 to 1.
I think the general consensus is that it was a 2 to 1 difference. I think that's what, at least that's what I've mostly heard when people talk about this battle, is 2 to 1 odds.
He deployed his units in their usual formation.
So
On the
thirsty,
left
this
flank,
video is so long.
Thracian and Thessalian cavalry, commanded by Parmenion. In the center, the Macedonian veterans of the phalanx, each armed with their...
So what I'm coming to understand or realize is it's sounding like Parmenion was probably just as responsible for these conquests and victories as Alexander was. Because Parmenion, as was shown in the Battle of Issus, if it probably weren't for him, they probably may not have held that flank as successfully as they did.
18-foot Sarissa pike. On the right flank, Alexander with his elite cavalry, the companions.
But obviously, me saying that Parmenion is very necessary for Alexander's victories is not diminishing Alexander's successes. He is still quite incredibly impressive for someone so young and what they are accomplishing.
And his best infantry, the Hypaspists.
Just trying to
These were
get
the
some
units with
representation
which
for
Alexander planned
Parmenion.
to launch his main attack. Greek hoplites formed a second line and supported both wings, which were angled back to guard against encirclement by the Persians. The battle began when Alexander led his wing out to the right, a move that took the Persians by surprise. Could Alexander really be trying to encircle their huge army?
Yes, he is trying. That's what he's trying to do.
The Persians mirrored his movement, taking troops away from their center to outflank Alexander and prevent him leaving the area they'd cleared for the Persian chariots. But Alexander's unusual maneuver was a trap to entice the Persians to weaken their center. When he saw that it had worked, he ordered his Greek cavalry to charge, to keep the Persians fixed in position.
He was definitely a ballsy
Giant
commander.
cavalry battle developed on the right wing. Darius, meanwhile, judging this to be the decisive moment, unleashed his chariots. But expert Agrianes javelin throwers took out horses and crews, while the Greek infantry opened lanes, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through. Now Alexander led his companion cavalry and parts of the Macedonian phalanx in a headlong charge straight at the weakened Persian center, fighting his way towards Darius himself. The sudden ferocity of Alexander's assault threw the Persians into panic. The center of the army broke and ran, King Darius himself leading the rout. But Alexander's left wing was in serious trouble. Parmenion, facing a huge onslaught by Persian cavalry, was virtually surrounded. Indian and Scythian horsemen had even ridden through a gap in the Greek line. But rather than wheeling and attacking the Greeks from behind, they'd carried straight on to loot their camp.
Oh.
Parmenion sent a desperate appeal to Alexander for help. The king abandoned his pursuit of Darius, regrouped, and charged the Persian right wing.
And this kind of shows the kind of character Alexander really had towards his, I guess, who he viewed as his peers, right? We've seen him be brutal, but now we're going to see him, at least this is going to demonstrate, I guess, now obviously it could cost him the battle if Parmenion loses the front if he doesn't help. But also killing Darius, he was able to capture Darius, could end the war immediately. And like sacrificing Parmenion could be in a sense justified for the capture of Darius, right? But no, Alexander turns and goes to help his commander, one of his generals. And obviously, as we've seen from Darius is not like that. Darius flees. We kind of get a sense that Darius is a bit of a coward. Now that might be a bit unfair to Darius, because obviously Darius he wants to avoid being captured, because one, he could be executed by Alexander. He has heard of Alexander's, brutality against people that have, resisted him. And also him escaping allows him to fight another day and maybe try and get one more battle in to try and get an advantage over Alexander. But I think this is the last battle Darius will really fight against Alexander.
It was the hardest and bloodiest fighting of the battle, claiming the lives of 60 of Alexander's companions. Finally, as news of Darius's flight spread across the battlefield, the last Persian horseman turned and fled. The Battle of Gaugamela was a stunning and complete victory for Alexander. According to ancient
My dog is
sources,
barking in the
he
background.
lost
I'm so
just a
sorry if
few
you can hear it.
hundred men, while the Persians lost thousands. Alexander had routed Darius's great army. And now the road to Babylon, the empire's main capital, lay open.
God, I would have loved to have seen Babylon in its prime. I think that's one of the sites in history that I think would be really cool to see.
The Macedonian king entered the great city in triumph, recognized by Persian officials as its new rightful ruler. So too at the city
Same
of
with
Susa,
Persepolis. I would like
where
to see I would like to see this in pretty much all the historically important big ancient cities. I'd love to
Alexander
see.
ceremonially took his seat upon the royal throne of Persia. In the Zagros Mountains, at a pass known as the Persian Gates, a courageous Persian force held up Alexander's army for a month. The Greeks eventually found a mountain path that bypassed their position, allowing them to encircle and wipe out the defenders.
Pretty similar to the Battle of
In
Thermopylae.
early 330 BC, Alexander reached Persepolis, the empire's ceremonial capital. Alexander wanted to appear as a liberator to the Persians, as a legitimate successor to King Darius. But now he ordered Persepolis to be pillaged and burnt.
Damn.
Retribution for the Persian invasion of Greece and the burning of Athens' sacred temples in 480 BC.
Okay. Ooh, a bit brutal, don't you think?
Alexander now headed north into Media, where Darius had taken refuge in the royal city of Ecbatana. Alexander was determined to capture Darius, but the fugitive king fled east in the hope of raising a new army in the provinces of Parthia, Bactria, and Sogdia. It was not to be. As Alexander closed in, the Persian king was murdered by one of his own governors,
Okay.
who then proclaimed himself the empire's new ruler.
Oh. What a dumb
Alexander
governor.
gave orders for Darius to be buried in the royal tombs of Persepolis, alongside his ancestors. Then he paused to organize.
Yeah, we kind of see the kind of person Alexander was. If he viewed you as a peer, he treated you with respect. He viewed Darius as a peer even though he was an enemy, so he still paid him respect. We kind of don't see that with the, I guess, the everyday person, right? He didn't seem to care too much for them, as he was willing to just brutally murder and destroy and burn entire cities.
His vast new empire. Alexander appointed viceroys to rule the provinces on his behalf, keeping several Persians who had sworn loyalty in their posts.
Much like the satraps, right? They're just with a different name for the most part.
He resumed his march east. His goal to find and kill the usurper Bessus, subjugate the empire's eastern provinces, and reach the far edge of the world.
Such a
In
great video. This
330
is such a good
BC,
video so far.
Alexander continued his march east. His goal, to find and kill Bessus, a Persian usurper claiming to be the rightful king, and to subjugate the empire's eastern provinces.
I wonder how much of
Alexander
his
headed
Indian
first
conquest we're going to
for
be talking
Arya,
about in this video.
today part of Afghanistan, where the Persian governor Satibarzanes had launched a revolt after initially pretending to submit to Alexander. The rebellion was crushed and Satibarzanes killed in single combat by a Greek cavalry officer. Nearby, Alexander founded
That Greek cavalry officer probably got a nice payday that
the
day.
city of Alexandria Ariana, modern Herat, one of around a dozen cities that Alexander would eventually found, almost all bearing his name.
Little egotistical, don't you think?
Alexander marched on to Frada. The Macedonian court had a long tradition of plots and assassination. 6 years before, Alexander's own father, King Philip, had been murdered by his bodyguard.
Had only 6 years. Wow.
He was now
Conquered that much.
informed that Philotas, commander of his companion cavalry, had uncovered a plot to assassinate Alexander, but kept it secret. Philotas and his father Parmenion were among the most respected of Alexander's commanders, and had played crucial roles in all his great victories. But when Philotas confessed, under torture, Alexander had him executed, then sent assassins back to Ecbatana, where Parmenion was governor, to kill him before he even heard of his son's death, and had a chance to turn against Alexander.
Oh, he's so brutal.
In 329, Alexander resumed his pursuit of Bessus. En route, he founded the city of Alexandria Arachosia, modern Kandahar in southern Afghanistan. As he reached Kunduz, Bessus was betrayed by his own men and handed over in chains. Alexander sent him back to Persia for execution as a kingslayer. Alexander pushed on into modern Tajikistan, where the Sogdians rose up against him. He had to fight off attacks by local tribes and take several towns by assault. On the banks of the Jaxartes River, he founded the city of Alexandria Escate, meaning Alexandria the Furthest, so named because he had, at last, reached the limit of the Persian Empire. This frontier was frequently raided by nomads, known to the Greeks as Scythians. Alexander lured them into a decisive battle near the Jaxartes.
Slaughtered them all, right?
The result was a crushing victory for the Macedonian king that put an end to the raids. But fighting against Bactrian and Sogdian tribes continued, frustrating Alexander and tying him down in a difficult guerrilla war. By now, many of the Macedonian troops were unhappy with Alexander. Most had not seen their homes in years, but their king seemed bent on conquest without end.
Yeah, another issue that would arise for Alexander, and also one of the reasons as to why he would inevitably turn around and start heading home before his untimely death by disease or poisoning, whichever you want to believe, because I don't think it's really set in stone as to what killed him, if it was just sickness or if it was murder. It's not entirely certain. But yeah, he would end up turning around because his troops were getting tired of war. I mean, they'd already been on campaign for 6-7 years at this point. In the end, they would have been on campaign for 10 years. Oh.
What was worse, he'd begun to adopt the rituals and dress of their defeated Persian enemy, customs they viewed as effeminate and decadent. At Marakanda, modern Samarkand, after a furious drunken argument, Alexander killed Clytus the Black. Clytus had been one of Alexander's best generals, and the man who'd saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus. Alexander was full of remorse, but his growing arrogance was alienating more and more old comrades. When he tried to make his countrymen perform the traditional Persian ritual of proskynesis, prostrating themselves before the king, he crossed a line. To Greeks, this was blasphemy.
I haven't heard of this before. This is new to me. Okay.
Only a god was worthy of such respect, and Alexander was forced to back down.
Oh, okay. He was trying to proclaim himself like a god in a sense?
In Bactria, another plot to assassinate Alexander was uncovered. This time the ringleader was a royal page, one of the sons of Macedonian nobility who attended the king. Hermolaus had become murderously bitter towards Alexander over a perceived injustice. He and his accomplices were tortured and then stoned to death.
Oof.
Callisthenes, Alexander's official historian, was also implicated in the conspiracy. He was thrown in prison, where he later died.
Ooh.
That summer, in 327, according to legend, Alexander became captivated by the beauty of Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian lord. Their marriage was also a sound political move, helping to end local revolt against his rule, and allowing him to continue his advance into modern Pakistan and India. Alexander now prepared to subdue the Persian Empire's most eastern provinces, which had yet to recognize his kingship. To do so, he would first have to cross the Hindu Kush mountains
Alexandria and the
and
Caucasus.
reach the Indus River valley. Advancing in two columns, his army won a series of skirmishes against the Aspasi and Asakani as they fought their way into what's now the Swat Valley of northern Pakistan. After a fierce siege, Alexander took the Asakanian capital of Masaga. According to legend, it was ruled by a beautiful queen, Cleophas, who bore Alexander a son and was allowed to keep her throne. The ruler of Taxila, near modern Islamabad, had formed an alliance with Alexander. Together, they marched to face Porus, king of Paravas, at the Battle of the Hydaspes.
He would get injured at this battle, wouldn't he? This is what I'm thinking of.
Alexander's costliest battle, as Porus's war elephants inflicted terrible casualties amongst the Greeks. But despite Porus's fearless leadership, the battle ended in a decisive victory for Alexander, winning him control of the Punjab. Alexander wanted to push on into India, to reach the great river, which ancient Greek geographers said formed the edge of the world. But at the river Hyphasis, known today as the Bias, his army mutinied. His men had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and not seen their homes in 8 years. They'd heard rumors of gigantic armies waiting for them in India. They refused.
Which probably isn't far from the truth, to be honest, because Indian, even at this time, while under the Persian Empire ruled roughly 25% of the world's population at its greatest extent, India was still big and had lots of people. While Alexander's army may be a veteran at this point because of the years spent fighting, they were exhausted just from constant fighting. They've only known fighting for the last 8 years of their lives. And they're much smaller than what they started off as, despite the victories, and obviously getting supplemented by more troops as they've gone through, right? Of course, they've been supplemented a little bit, but they're a tired army, so it's fair to, not want to keep fighting. You want to go home and, relax.
Refused to go any further. Alexander was furious, but had to turn the army around. He followed the rivers of the Punjab to the sea, a journey that took 10 months. On the way, he defeated the Malians, but while leading the assault on their capital, was wounded in the chest.
Okay, this is where he got wounded.
Nearly killed. On reaching the coast, part of the army under Nearchus boarded ships and returned to Persia by sea, sailing through the Straits of Hormuz and entering the Persian Gulf. It was one of the great ancient voyages of exploration, as these waters had been previously unknown to Greeks. Meanwhile, Alexander led the rest of the army back by land through the Gedrosian Desert, today in southern Pakistan. But extreme heat and shortages of food and water led to terrible suffering and many deaths among his army. On his return to Persia, Alexander executed several of his viceroys and governors, men accused of ruling unjustly and robbing temples and tombs during his long absence in the east. At Susa, he arranged a magnificent mass marriage of Macedonian officers to 80 Persian noblewomen to strengthen bonds between his two kingdoms. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses. He also paid all his soldiers' debts and ordered 30,000 youths from across the empire to be trained in the Macedonian art of war.
So it sounds like he was prepping for another conquest, probably his invasion of India. What I'm going to guess. What he was prepping for, at least, before he dies.
But at Opis, his Macedonian troops mutinied. They were offended by Alexander's apparent preference for Persian advisors and Persian ways. Alexander had the ringleaders executed and made a speech to the men reminding them of the glories they'd won together, and leading eventually to an emotional reconciliation. At Ecbatana, Alexander's closest and most trusted friend, Hephaestion, died of fever.
Isn't it rumored, or at least kind of like confirmed, that Alexander and Hephaestion had they were a couple, right? Is that true? I know Alexander was definitely, he had his relations with the fellow men, but I don't remember the name of it. I think it was this guy. I think it was Hephaestion.
The king was grief-stricken, went days without eating, and ordered a period of public mourning across the empire. Alexander waged a successful campaign against the mountain raiders of Kossia, who not even the Persian kings had been able to subdue. Returning to Babylon, he was met by embassies from distant peoples, come to recognize his greatness. Ethiopians, Libyans, European Scythians, Lucanians, Etruscans, Gauls, and Iberians. Alexander's Bactrian wife, Roxana, was now pregnant. But as he planned his next campaign to Arabia and beyond, he developed a sudden fever and died days later, aged just 32.
God, just the amount he conquered at such a young age, it's crazy.
The cause of Alexander's death has never been established.
Okay,
it may have been malaria, cholera, typhus, or poison.
Yeah. And for the successor states, the spoils go the victor, as I think he said.
Alexander died undefeated in battle. His reputation as a brilliant, fearless, and daring military commander remains undimmed. His decade-long campaign created one of the largest empires ever known, stretching from Greece to Pakistan. But it was vast and unstable, held together only by his own brilliance and name. Alexander left no plans for his succession, and his generals soon began fighting among themselves to carve out their own empires. In the Wars of the Successors, Alexander's widow Roxana and his young son were murdered. His own gold sarcophagus, en route to Macedonia for burial, was hijacked and ended up in Alexandria in Egypt. Today, its location remains one of the world's great unsolved mysteries.
True. True.
Few
I would
men
like to know
have ever
where it
had
went.
such an impact on the course of history as Alexander the Great. The breathtaking achievements of his short life ushered in the Hellenistic Age, as Greek ideas spread across the territory of his former empire, fusing with local traditions to trigger new developments in art, science, government and language. Some of the successor kingdoms to his great empire were short-lived. Others endured for centuries. But all, in turn, would fall to new forces.
Yep.
And in the West, to the rising power of Rome.
That musical transition, though.
Research and artwork for this video comes from Osprey.
I don't think I've read any of these books. No, none of these were the ones I've read on Alexander's empire. But that was Alexander the Great. Whoa, long video. I don't really like reacting to these long videos because, and I don't want to split them into parts because I'm kind of forgetful. I'll forget what I've talked about in a previous part, and I don't like really having to reiterate too much in one video, or what would technically be like two part. Let's say I split this in half, made a part 2 series. I'd forget what I said in part 1, right? But you know, reacting to these long videos is, I feel like I don't provide, as the video goes longer and longer, as we get further into the video, I feel like I don't provide a substantive, real, you know, I don't really get my thoughts out as well as I do in the beginning. Like, my reaction becomes less and less as the video goes on. So these longer videos, like Epic History TV has other series that are like this, like Napoleon. So I will be reacting to more videos by Epic History. It's just that they won't be too often, just because they take so long. And what I could have done instead of like watching this video and reacting to it is I could have reacted to maybe 3 other videos that are shorter, that are like 10 to 20 minutes long, right? But you know, it's still a great video. I highly recommend you check it out yourself. If you're not already subscribed to Epic History TV, what's wrong with you? You should. They're a great channel. I love their videos. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to leave a suggestion down below as to what you'd like to see me react to next. I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a good day. Thank you.